everyone, thanks for tuning in. I hope you're all well wherever you are and whatever you're up to. I'm Lauren, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make a cheats quilt like this one using a really lovely panelled fabric. Now, regular followers to my YouTube channel and my website and blog will know that my heart truly does lie with dressmaking and making clothes for myself and sometimes my children as well. But I do now and again like to dip into other types of projects. As long as they're nice and quick and easy and fun to do, then I'm happy to give things a try. So although I'm going to show you how to make a quilt in this video, I'm not proclaiming to be a quilting expert. It is a very specific subsection of sewing, and if you're looking for precise technicalities of quilting, it might be better if you check out a different video. But if you're happy to just give things a go, give it a try, make things as really quick and easy as possible, then I think this project is for you. So the fabric that I'm going to feature in this video is a new collection from Dashwood Studios. So it's all on quilting cotton. It's designed to be used for these types of projects, but there are other types of designs that work in the same principle, and essentially the main panelled fabric has either squares or rectangles that look a little bit like patchwork, but it's just a sheet of fabric. It's just like a plain section of fabric. So it means that you can just straight away start to layer up the components of your quilt and put it together really quickly without having to do the patchwork bits. So the collection that features in the video is called Good Vibes, and it's a really lovely colourful collection of fabrics. We've got the main panel, and then we've got 3 of the coordinates that go with it as well. So there's a really lovely rainbow colour one, which I used for the back of the quilt, and then we've got a bird one, it's really lovely sort of teal colour, and then a nice bright pinky one as well. So you could sort of mix and match any of those fabrics together to come and make your quilt. I've also made a blog post to go along with this video, and in there I've written out all of the things that you need and the things that I used and the dimensions and everything that I used to make my size of quilt, and then I've included links to the fabric as well. But the same principle is going to apply if you're using another type of fabric that's got panels on it as well and you're putting it together. You can still follow along the same steps that I'm going to talk you through. So the quilt that I made is somewhere between 1 metre and 1.10 m, so roughly a sort of square, and I basically based that off the width of the fabric. So the fabric is about 110 centimetres roughly. By the time you take off the sort of printed bit of the selvage, kind of shrinks it down a little bit. So I had 1.1 metres of the main panel fabric and the same for the backing, and then I used 0.5 metre of the binding fabric as well. And that roughly made that sort of size of quilt. So in the blog post that goes with this video, I've linked all of the fabrics that I used to make my sample. For this specific panel, the rectangles that make up the panel are around about 12 centimetres tall by 10 centimetres wide. So depending on how much fabric you buy, we sell by the 10 centimetres. It might mean that you get a section of fabric where the line of the fabric as it's been cut from the bolt isn't directly in between the panels, like you might get part of a panel. So if you don't want that in your quilt and you only want completely full panels in your quilt, then you might want to maybe get a little bit extra, or if you're not bothered and you're happy to kind of go with whatever, then the minimum that you're going to need is 1.1 metres. Obviously you can make a much bigger quilt if you wanted to, but what you would have to do is probably just join sections of that main panel fabric together and the backing fabric before you start layering everything up. But other than that, the principle is going to apply whatever size of quilt you want to make. I used cotton wadding to go in the middle. We do also sell a polyester alternative as well, which is obviously a little bit cheaper. It's quite a lightweight wadding. It's not going to give like a really thick kind of puffy quilt, but it does feel really nice, and it's totally machine washable as well. That helps to make the layering up nice and smooth if your pieces are ironed totally flat. First of all, just make sure you've got water in your iron so it generates steam and you give it a really good press. The other things that you're going to need to make this type of project is a walking foot for your machine. I would say it is probably really better if you do have a walking foot. If you didn't have a walking foot and you try to sew the project without it, really what you're going to find is that the 3 layers that you sort of build up to make the quilt just tend to like are going to sort of slip around a little bit more, and the machine's going to struggle to sort of feed it through evenly. The idea with the walking foot is that because it's got feed dogs on it, that the fabric gets fed from the bottom and the top as you're sewing with a walking foot. Whereas normally when you just sew with a regular foot, there's just feed dogs in the bottom, so it's only the bottom fabric that's getting pulled through. So walking foot does definitely make this project much easier to do and will give you a better sort of finish as well. You'll also need either lots of safety pins or some kind of quilt pins to hold all of the layers together, or a temporary spray adhesive, which is what I used for this sample. It's really quick and easy to use, and I'm going to explain how to do that later. And then it is also useful if you've got a rotary cutter and a cutting mat and a quilting ruler as well, so that you can cut the binding strips that go around the edge of it. If you don't have them, then you can kind of work around it, but it just does make it quicker and easier, and probably a bit more accurate if you do have those tools if you're going to make this project. Okay, so in terms of preparing your fabrics before you get started into your project, at the very, very least, I would recommend ironing your fabrics totally flat with a nice hot steamy iron before you get started. You could pre-wash them if you wanted to. You don't need to pre-wash the wadding because it's pre-shrunk already, but you could wash the cotton fabrics if you wanted to. I didn't for mine because I just wanted to get stuck in. And sometimes what you can find is if you don't pre-wash them, once the quilt's made and it gets laundered for the first time, that it can sometimes just sort of contract a little bit and give a bit more of a sort of textured, slightly sort of crinkled appearance, which I personally really like. So that's another reason why I don't usually pre-wash quilting cottons before actually making them. But if you wanted to try and keep things like a bit smoother and a bit flatter once the quilt's actually made and it's getting laundered, then you can pre-wash your fabrics in however you intend to launder the quilt afterwards, whether that's at 30 degrees or 40 degrees, and then obviously make sure you still give them a really good steamy hot iron press afterwards as well before you start layering them up to sew everything together. So you need to lay your fabrics out on a big surface, so whether that's the floor or a table, if you've got a big enough surface area on a table, and you want the wrong side of the backing fabric facing up, and then you want your wadding on top, and then you want your front panelled fabric on top with the right side facing up. So you've basically got a sandwich with the wadding in between, and then the backing and the main fabric are outward facing. So all of those three layers are going to get sewn together. We neaten off the edges, and then we put a binding around it to finish it off. So try to get the edges as lined up as best you can. Usually in quilting, you have to sort of have everything bigger than you end up wanting it to be because things can move around as you sew them together. So I have given sort of quite conservative fabric recommendations to sort of just get the most out of the littlest amount of fabric, if you see what I mean. So you don't need to try and get things lined up as best you can. So make sure the selvages of the main panel fabric and the backing fabric are lined up and that kind of thing. Then just smooth everything out, make sure it's totally flat, there's no wrinkles or creases in anything at all. So you might spend a bit of time doing that, just sort of smoothing. Go from the centre, kind of smooth out towards the edges, towards the corners. Then you have to secure those 3 layers of fabric together before you then sew on the sewing machine. So there's a few options to do that, which I touched on before. Either you're going to be using safety pins, and I would suggest just putting a safety pin or some kind of quilting pin or something in the middle of each of the rectangles that make up that panelled fabric on sort of alternate ones, like in a kind of grid shape. So always start in the middle and smooth out, smooth, and then just put all of the safety pins in as you go along. The alternative is to use the spray adhesive. So I use this Prim one here. I think there are a variety of different ones that you can get, but I use this Prim one here, which we have in the shop. And literally all you do is give the can a really good shake before you start, and then just open the layers up. So you're going to have to do it between the backing fabric and the wadding, and then the main panel fabric and the wadding. So you have to do it twice effectively. So just peel everything back, give it a good spray. You're supposed to spray it about 30 centimetres away from the fabric surface, and then just pop that wadding back down, smooth it out, make sure there's no wrinkles, everything's totally flat, smooth to the edges, and then do the same for that top layer. So then you'll be spraying on the wadding, and then putting the main panel fabric on top again, sort of smoothing it out. And you can still kind of peel them apart. I mean, it doesn't like glue it together that it's not going to come apart at all, but it definitely secures it much better than not doing anything at all. And it obviously saves you lots of time from having to put lots of safety pins or some kind of alternative in as well, because as well as having to put the pins in, you have to remove them as well. Whereas with the spray adhesive, it's just a temporary thing. It's just going to sort of kind of wear off and sort of come out in the first wash, the first time you wash the quilt. So once you've got those layers all secured and together, then it's time to attach the walking foot onto your machine, and then you're going to sew with the main panel fabric facing up at you as you sew it, and you're just going to sew lots of lines in between all of those rectangles. So I always like to start in the middle and sew out towards the outer edge, then I'll spin the whole quilt 90 degrees, and then I'll sew again from the centre out towards the edge. So with every line I keep spinning the quilt 90 degrees and going in the other direction. So you kind of work sort of into one corner at a time, and then you kind of move around to the next quarter of the quilt, and you go from the centre again, just working your way out, always smoothing, always kind of pushing everything out as you go, so that you don't get any kind of wrinkles or sort of little lumps in the fabric as you sew all of that. So it does take a bit of time. I usually lengthen my stitch length to 3mm rather than 2.5, just because it's a bit quicker and is for this type of top stitching, you know, it looks good. Don't worry too much about being like completely precisely accurate on that join line between the two rectangles. You know, if it's a couple of millimeters off in a few places, honestly, nobody's going to notice, and it will still do the job and sort of give the nice effect of the quilt. So yeah, you just have to kind of keep ploughing on, put the full speed on your sewing machine, get your foot to the floor and just blitz through it all and get all of those lines done. And then once you've got them all secure, you then have to trim the edges to sort of neaten them off. So you're looking at kind of evening things out here. So it might be that you're trimming the selvages off, or you're trimming just a little bit of extra fabric off. Now, what I found when I made my quilt is that there was in some places round the edge where the 3 layers didn't all exactly sort of end at the same point, and if I was to make them all, trim them back to where all 3 layers were together, it would mean I would kind of lose a bit extra of my quilt. So there was a couple of places round the quilt where I just trimmed it off to the sort of just following like the grid of the panel, and then it meant that they're right at the very edge there maybe wasn't a bit of wadding, or there wasn't a bit of backing fabric, but the binding that I'm going to show you to make can cover that, and then it doesn't really matter that you've not got wadding or a bit of backing fabric under that. You totally can't tell from the finished quilt. So it depends how kind of precise and particular you want to be, but I'm going to just show you what I did. I feel like it totally worked fine, and the quilt looks really good, so you can kind of choose whatever your personal preference is when it comes to things like that. So in terms of actually making the binding fabric, usually what's a bit quicker and easier to do, if you're going to be cutting like really long strips of the binding out, is if you press it really flat first of all with your hot steamy iron, and then fold it so the selvages are together, and then just like keep folding it in half. So fold it in half again, and then fold it in half again, so it's like a little stack of fabric that you've got. And then using your quilting ruler and rotary cutter, you just have to sort of square everything up and neaten off one edge. So you'll find that the sort of cut edge is just irregular, like all of the edges don't totally line up there, but it's more about getting your selvages and the folds and the fabric, they need to kind of be lined up to make that rectangular shape. So just neaten off that edge, and then for my binding strip I cut a width of 4 inches, okay, because it ends up getting folded over, so you do have to do it like wider really than you think you need, because it gets applied in a bit of a different way than maybe like traditional bias binding that you would put on a dressmaking garment. We're also cutting this binding on the straight grain of the fabric as well. Hopefully you've picked that up from the way that we folded the fabric. It doesn't need to be in the bias because it is a square or a rectangle and the edges are totally straight, so there is no advantage to it being on the bias at all. These strips can be on the grain. So then I just cut my strips 4 inches wide, so then it gives you a really, when you open it out, it gives you a really long length of fabric. And then the idea is that you join them together to make a really, really long strip to go all the way around your quilt. Now there's a couple of options for how you can attach them together. The method that uses the least amount of fabric is to just attach the 2 short edges together and then sew them down the middle and press the seam allowance open, and that gives you like a straight seam that is at 90 degrees to the cut edge of it. Technically, I think in quilting it's better if you actually attach them with a diagonal seam line. So to do that, you have to sort of overlap the 2 strips at a 90-degree angle to each other and then sew a diagonal seam in that overlap, trim the edges, press the seam allowance open so your seam ends up being on the diagonal. It's up to you however you want to do it. I find it's a bit quicker and yeah, it uses less fabric if you do it the sort of straight way. But as ever in sewing, there's lots of options. So again, whatever you feel is going to work for your own personal preference in that one. So once you've got all your strips joined together, then you need to iron it so that wrong sides are together and you're ironing it totally in half. So you're not turning it in at all, you're just ironing it completely in half. And then it's time to attach it onto your quilt. So you need to start in the middle of one of the long edges. Doesn't matter too much what edge it is, just don't start in a corner. And then you want to start lining up the raw edge of your binding with the raw edge of your quilt, and you've got the right side or the sort of panelled side of the quilt facing up at you as you do this. You want to leave a bit of a tail at the start of the binding so that you can join it together once you've been all the way round. And the idea is that you're just going to pin until you get to that first corner, and then you're going to sew it on. So again, you still need your walking foot on the sewing machine. I just kept a 3mm stitch length on as well. And I used a 1/2 inch seam allowance to do this. And whatever seam allowance you use at this point will be approximately the width of binding that you will see once the quilt is finished, because you have to fold that binding sort of back on itself and round to the back of the quilt. So if you use a narrower seam allowance here, it just means you'll see a smaller amount of that fabric on the binding. So that's the sort of choice there, is how much of it you want to see. So yeah, I used a 1/2 inch. So when you approach towards that corner, you have to stop sewing before you get to that very bottom edge by whatever seam allowance you're using. So as I was using 1/2 inch seam allowance, I was sewed straight down the binding towards that first corner, but I stopped before I got to the very end by 1/2 inch. Then you need to do like a little reverse back and forward, and then to get a really nice neat mitered corner, you have to fold the binding up and away from the quilt with a 45-degree fold that's coming out of the corner, and then keep that fold in place and fold the binding back down, or sort of folding it back on itself, so that then the raw edge of the binding is lining up with the next edge of your quilt, and then pin it in place. And then this time when you come to sew it, you need to sew from the very, very top edge all the way down to the next corner, stopping 1/2 inch before that next edge, that next sort of corner of the quilt. And you just repeat that on all 4 corners, and then when you get back to where you started, you'll just have this little gap with 2 sort of loose ends of your binding that then need joined up together. So I just joined them in the simple method of like butting up the short straight edges together. So I just sort of folded them flat and kind of worked out where they needed to go, and finger pressed a crease in it so I could see where they needed to join. Opened the binding back out again and just sewed straight down that line, trimmed the seam allowances, pressed it open, and then pressed it nice and flat, and then you can just sew that little sort of gap closed, and then that's your binding joined up all the way around the quilt. Then the next sort of final stage is to then press that binding up and away from the front of the quilt, and then round and over to the back of the quilt. At the corners, you just have to sort of pull everything round to the back of the quilt, and then you can press it so that you end up with like a diagonal fold coming out of the corner as well. Now, because we did quite a wide binding in this example, it means that you're going to see more of the binding on the reverse of the quilt, which I personally quite liked. It just meant that you got to see a little bit more of the design on that fabric, and because the backing fabric is a bit plainer compared to the front, it just seemed nice to sort of have that contrast. But obviously you could totally customize that. You could make it so that the amount of fabric you see in the front and the back is the same just by cutting a narrower strip. So whatever you're going to prefer, you can choose, you can choose your own design when it comes to that. The principles are going to be the same. So once it is all pressed into place, then I like to just do hand stitching to finish it off and secure that binding down. So just get comfy in front of the TV in the evening with my hand sewing needle, and then I'll just stitch all the way around. So I like to use an invisible ladder stitch to do this. And I always use a double length of thread rather than a single length, because it just makes it a little bit stronger and it's less likely that the needle's going to come unthreaded as you're sewing and that sort of thing. So you just need to secure your thread within the seam allowance, so on the back of the quilt. And then the idea is that you're basically doing a running stitch between the backing of the quilt and the fold of the binding. So you're just taking even sized stitches in and out of that fold into the back of the quilt, and then when you get to the corner you do the same thing. So you just sew up towards the point of the corner, come back down, and then continue around the other edge of the quilt all the way around, and then you're finished. You've got a really lovely quilt. So basically you've just skipped the whole kind of patchwork and sewing smaller bits of fabric together to get the front of your quilt. But essentially the principle is going to be the same if you did do your own patchwork and you did sew bits of fabric together to make the front of the quilt. The way that you put the quilt together would be exactly the same, layering up the three, stacking up the 3 layers with the wadding in the middle and securing it together, sewing it, etc., and then doing the binding. So I hope that has given you an idea just of a little bit of a different project to do. As I said, the blog post that goes with this video will be linked in the description, and within that there's links to all of the fabrics that I used as well. Depending on when you're watching this video, like if it's very much in the future and this particular collection isn't available anymore, I do know that we're having more of this type of design of panel coming into the shop. So it might be that there's a sort of slight variation, but the idea is still the same. If anybody's got any questions at all, you can always leave a comment below and I shall try and get back to you, or you can call the shop or email the shop, and the G&G team can also help you that way as well. But thanks so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed to my channel already, then just remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss out on my next video, and I'll see you next time. Bye!